The clock in the Dunmore study read 3:30 in the morning. Rosalind sat perfectly still in her black widow's gown, her hands folded in her lap with the practiced composure of a woman who had spent 10 years learning how not to fall apart in public. The letter in front of her had been unfolded and refolded so many times that the crease had gone soft at the corners. She did not need to read it again. She had read it 11 times already. She knew every word. She knew the handwriting was Edmund's. She knew the date at the top was dated 4 years ago. She knew that while she had been performing the role of the Marquess of Dunmore's loyal, gracious, impeccably dressed wife, smiling across drawing rooms, nodding at operas, cutting Rosalind Caldwell out of every invitation list with quiet surgical precision, Edmund had already known the truth. He had known for 4 years. He had found Dunmore's fabricated evidence, traced it back to its source, and quietly, without a single word to anyone, buried it. Not for his own sake, but for hers. She pressed her hand flat against the letter. Outside the window, London was dark and completely indifferent. A carriage rattled past on the cobblestones below. Somewhere in the upper floors of this house, her 9-year-old son was asleep with his arms thrown over the side of the bed the way he always slept, careless and warm and entirely unaware that the man whose face he wore had been standing a mile away from him for the last 4 years, protecting a secret he never asked to carry. Rosalind picked up her pen. She dipped it in ink, and held it over the blank page for a long moment. Then she wrote 4 words. "I need to explain." She sealed the letter, pressed Dunmore's signet ring, which was hers now, by law, into the wax out of pure spite, and sent it by messenger before dawn. Edmund Caldwell received it at 7 in the morning. He read it standing in the hallway of his Mayfair townhouse, still in his riding coat, having not yet slept. He read it slowly. Then he set it down on the hall table, and after just a few seconds, he picked it up and read it again. His butler, who had served Edmund for 9 years and had learned to read catastrophe in the set of his employer's jaw, quietly took his hat and riding gloves without being asked. Edmund said nothing for a very long time. Then, at long last, he said to his butler, "Have the carriage readied." As the butler lowered his head in obedience and walked out, Edmund muttered to himself, "I need to go find out the truth."
Hello there, and welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. If you are new here, this channel is where history's most devastating love stories get the endings they deserve. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this one with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Now, let's go back to where it all began.
London, April, 1812. The night was warm for spring, which meant every window in Lady Ashworth's townhouse had been thrown open, and every person of consequence in the ton had crowded themselves into her ballroom regardless. The chandeliers were lit to excess. The champagne was French and probably shouldn't have been, given the war. But nobody mentioned the war. That was the rule. Rosalind Vane stood near the far window in a gown the colour of sage green that her mother had called sensible and her aunt had called unfortunate. She was not thinking about the gown. She was thinking about the man on the other side of the ballroom who had been pretending not to look at her for the last 40 minutes with the absolute worst poker face she had ever seen on a duke. Edmund Caldwell, the Duke of Caldwell, 20 years of age, newly come into his title, and apparently constitutionally incapable of subtlety, looked away the precise moment she turned toward him. He had done this 8 times. She had counted. She pressed her lips together to suppress the smile. It did not entirely work. "You are doing the thing again," said her cousin Marjorie from approximately 2 inches behind her left shoulder, which was Marjorie's natural operating distance. "I am doing no thing," Rosalind countered. "Your jaw goes soft when you look at him," she argued. "My jaw is perfectly composed." "Rosalind," Marjorie sighed, "your jaw looks like it's been given good news." Rosalind scoffed and turned away from the window entirely and accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman with the dignity of a woman who absolutely had not just been caught making eyes at a duke across a ballroom for the 8th consecutive social event. "He is going to ask me to dance," she said, very quietly, for Marjorie's ears only. "If he works up the nerve before supper, I will know the answer by midnight." Marjorie's eyebrows went up. The answer to what? Rosalind looked into her lemonade and said nothing, and Marjorie's eyebrows disappeared into her hairline. Edmund did work up the nerve. He appeared at her elbow at 9:20 with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this approach and abandoned the rehearsal halfway across the room. His cravat was impeccable. His dark hair had a tendency to fall across his forehead that his valet was clearly fighting a losing battle against. His eyes, which were a deep and unfair shade of navy that Rosalind had not adequately prepared herself for at close range, were fixed on her with an intensity that would have been alarming on anyone less obviously terrified. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said. A pause. The orchestra began something in 3/4 time. "I wonder," Edmund said, "whether you would do me the honor." "Yes," she said quickly. Edmund blinked. "I hadn't even finished." "Yes," she said again, and held out her hand. He took it. And the look on his face in that moment, the split second of pure, unguarded relief, was the thing Rosalind would spend the next 10 years trying to forget and failing at entirely. They danced. They talked. He was nothing like she had expected, which was to say he was entirely without the casual arrogance she had anticipated from a man of his position. He was earnest. He had opinions about agricultural reform that he delivered with the animation of someone who had genuinely lain awake thinking about crop rotation, and for reasons she could not have explained at any prior point in her life, she found this incredibly captivating. He asked questions and then actually listened to her answers. He laughed when she was sharp with him, which was often, because she had decided within the first 5 minutes that she liked him enough to bother. By the end of the set, Rosalind Vane was in considerable trouble and she knew it. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing as Edmund returned her to Marjorie with a bow that lasted approximately 1 beat longer than protocol required, was that the Marquess of Dunmore had been watching them from the card-room doorway for the last 20 minutes. George Dunmore was 53, florid, and brilliant in the specific way that people are brilliant when they have spent decades acquiring information they were never meant to have. He had his fat fingers in 14 parliamentary committees and owned the debt notes of 6 lords who would cheerfully vote against their own mothers if he asked them to. He watched Edmund Caldwell return Rosalind Vane's hand to her side and felt the first click of a plan assembling itself behind his pale, cold eyes. Edmund Caldwell was exactly the sort of principled, popular young duke who could derail 3 years of Dunmore's parliamentary strategy in a single well-timed speech if he ever worked out what Dunmore was doing. Dunmore had been monitoring him. He had been hoping for a weakness. He had just found one. The courtship, such as it was, happened in stolen fragments over the following 2 months. London society noticed everything, but what it saw was a duke paying polite, measured attention to a respectable if undistinguished young woman. What it did not see was the note Rosalind left tucked inside a book at Hatchard's that Edmund collected on a Tuesday, or the 40 minutes they spent in her aunt's garden during a house party while everyone else was playing at Pall Mall, talking about everything and nothing with the desperate speed of 2 people who understood that these conversations were numbered. Edmund told her about his father, the way the old duke had been brilliant and cold in equal measure, and the way Edmund had spent his entire childhood trying to earn a warmth that the man was constitutionally incapable of giving. He said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse to hear. Rosalind told him about her mother's illness and the 2 years she had spent as the adult in a household that was supposed to be hers to enjoy. She had never said it aloud to anyone. The words came out of her mouth and felt lighter afterward, which frightened her. In June, in her aunt's walled garden, with rain threatening on the horizon and a bee investigating Edmund's jacket with focused determination, he told her he intended to speak to her father. She already knew what her answer would be. She said, "My father will say you're too grand for us." Your father would be wrong. He is frequently wrong. It is something of a specialty of his. Edmund caught her hand. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it with a speech prepared. He just reached out and took her hand and held it, and looked at her with his navy eyes and all that earnest, undefended feeling, and said, "Rosalind, I would very much like to spend my life arguing with you about things that matter. Would that be agreeable to you?" She looked at him for a long moment. The bee abandoned his jacket. The rain began, distantly. "Profoundly agreeable," she said. It was not a formal betrothal. It was a promise, which felt like something more. They agreed to wait until the end of the season to make it official. There were practical concerns, there were family considerations, there was the general machinery of society to be navigated. They had time. They had all the time in the world. This was the last true thing Rosalind believed for the next 10 years. It was the 19th of July, 1812, when it ended. She was attending Lady Fairfax's card party, One of those thin summer evenings where the ton reassembled itself between proper seasons with the grim determination of people who do not know what to do with themselves if they stop performing. Marjorie was there. Edmund was not. He had parliamentary business and had sent a note that made her smile at breakfast and hide the note in her vanity drawer. She was playing at whist and losing graciously when the Marquess of Dunmore sat down in the empty chair beside her. Not at the table. Beside her. Turned toward her. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and slightly wrong, and feel the deliberate weight of his attention the way you feel a door close in a room with no windows. "Miss Vane," he said, pleasantly. "How delightful. I wonder if you would take a turn with me. I have a matter I should like to discuss." She did not want to take a turn with him. Everything in her said don't. But there was no polite mechanism for refusing a marquis in full view of the room, and Dunmore knew this the way he knew everything, precisely, and by design. She rose. She took his arm. They walked to the far end of the room near the empty fireplace. Dunmore smiled his closed-mouth smile. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. He held it between two fingers and let her see it without offering it to her. "I came into possession of something interesting," he said. "Letters. A correspondence between the Duke of Caldwell and a gentleman of my acquaintance. Very illuminating letters, as it happens. The sort that, placed before the right committee, would see a young duke facing charges of correspondence with agents of the French government." The room was 20 feet away. Someone laughed at the card table. The sound was entirely from another world. Rosalind kept her face very still. "That is a serious allegation." "It is," Dunmore agreed. "A very serious one. It would be quite devastating for a man of his position. The trial alone, even if he were ultimately cleared, and I am not confident he would be, would destroy everything he has spent the last year building." He paused. "Everything he is planning." "Those letters are fabricated," she said. Her voice was steady. She was rather proud of it. "They are very good fabrications," Dunmore said. "I have had them examined. They would hold for long enough to do what needs doing." He folded the paper and returned it to his coat. "I am going to be married at the end of the month. I find myself in need of a wife of some particular quality, composed, intelligent, capable of managing a household of some complexity. I thought of you." The world narrowed to the space between them. "You will accept, or I will deliver those letters on Monday morning," he said. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Simply. The way a man states the weather. "You have until dawn to consider it." He bowed. He left her standing by the empty fireplace. Rosalind stood completely still for 3 minutes. She did not cry. She did not signal to Marjorie. She worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, in silence, reaching the end of every avenue and finding it closed. If she told Edmund, he would confront Dunmore. Edmund was principled to his bones and would never in his life submit to blackmail. The confrontation would trigger the letters being submitted. The trial would begin. Even if Edmund was eventually cleared, the process would take years, cost him his reputation, his political future, everything he had worked for, everything he was trying to build. If she told no one, and said yes, she would lose everything. But Edmund would be safe. Edmund would be free. Edmund would, eventually, recover from losing her. People recovered from heartbreak. They did not recover from treason charges in the House of Lords. It was not really a choice at all. It only felt like one. At 2 in the morning she wrote a note to Marjorie explaining she had developed a headache and retired early. At 3 she was in Dunmore's solicitor's study in her best evening cloak, signing her name in the place indicated. At 4 she was in a hired carriage moving through dark London streets, watching the city slide past the window, already composing herself into the shape of the woman she would have to be for the rest of her life. She did not leave Edmund a note. What would she have written? She thought about this for 10 years and never answered it. Edmund woke at 8 to the sound of his valet drawing the curtains and the entirely ordinary prospect of a Tuesday in summer. He ate breakfast. He read the paper. At 11 he received a social note from his friend Harwick that mentioned, in the breathless parenthetical way that social notes always delivered catastrophe, that there had been quite the surprise announcement. The Marquess of Dunmore, of all people, married quietly at dawn to a Miss Vane, second daughter of Sir William Vane. Can you imagine, at his age? Edmund read the line twice. Then he stood up very slowly from the breakfast table, walked to the window that overlooked the garden, and placed both hands flat on the glass. His valet, who had entered to collect the tray, stopped in the doorway. Edmund said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled and entirely unrecognizable, "Leave it." The valet left. Edmund stood at the window for a very long time. In the garden below, a sparrow landed on the iron bench where Rosalind had sat last Thursday afternoon and told him, laughing, that his opinions on crop rotation were the most attractive thing about him. It pecked at something. It flew away. Edmund turned from the window. He was never quite the same after that morning. Not in any way that could be pointed to. He showed up to Parliament. He gave his speeches. He argued his positions with the cold, precise ferocity of a man who had rerouted every warm impulse he possessed into the service of being right. Society called him formidable. Society called him cold. They said he had never recovered from Dunmore's new wife, said it with the particular relish that London applied to a duke made a fool of by a woman. He did not correct them. He had no correction to offer. He did not understand what had happened any more than they did. He only knew that she was gone, and that she had gone willingly, and that whatever he thought they were building in that garden in June had been a construction entirely of his own imagination. He believed this for 8 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Then Dunmore's solicitor sent a box to a widow on Grosvenor Square, and everything that Edmund thought he understood began to come apart at the seams. The first year was the worst, and Rosalind knew it would be, so she treated it like a wound that needed setting before it could heal. You did not coddle a wound. You pressed it closed and you moved. She moved. The Dunmore estate in Berkshire was large, cold, and run with the rigid efficiency of a household that had not had a mistress in 11 years. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, was a tall, narrow woman who had clearly expected to continue running the house indefinitely and viewed the new Marchioness with the specific hostility of someone whose territory has been annexed without warning. The cook had opinions. The head footman had even more opinions. Every room smelled faintly of old tobacco and male indifference. Rosalind assessed it in 3 days. She restructured it in 3 weeks. Not loudly. Not with confrontation. She simply began making decisions, menus, household accounts, the redecoration of the morning room in a color that actually reflected light, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been managing a household since she was 17 and was not remotely intimidated by a disapproving housekeeper. By October, Mrs. Pratt brought her the accounts voluntarily. By December, the house ran like a different machine entirely. Dunmore noticed. He watched her the way he watched everything, with those pale, calculating eyes that missed nothing and gave nothing back. He did not compliment her. He was not a man who complimented. But he began to include her in his dinner conversations. He asked her read certain parliamentary briefs and tell him what she thought. The first time he did this, she suspected a trap. She answered anyway, directly and without softening. He looked at her for a moment. "You have a good mind," he said. It was the closest thing to warmth she would ever receive from him, and she catalogued it in the same drawer as she used for all the other things she could not do anything about. She did not love him. He knew she did not love him. Some unspoken treaty existed between them on this point. He would not insult her by pretending their arrangement was anything other than what it was, and she would not insult him by performing an affection neither of them believed. It made things simpler. It made things bearable. It did not make them good. She thought about Edmund at specific, inconvenient moments. When she was reading by the window and the afternoon light went a particular shade of gold. When she heard a piece of music at an assembly that they had danced to once, that first night, and she had to breathe very slowly and carefully through the 4 minutes it took the orchestra to finish. When she was invited, as the Marchioness of Dunmore she was invited everywhere now, the bitter joke of it, to an evening party in the spring of 1813, and she arrived at the top of the stairs and looked down into the room below and saw Edmund standing near the fireplace, thinner than she remembered, saying something to the man beside him in that focused, intense way he had, and she gripped the banister so hard that her glove pressed a seam into her palm. He looked up. She did not look away. She was done with looking away. She had chosen this, and she would carry it with her spine straight and her chin up because the alternative was to fold entirely, and she was not built for folding. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his conversation. 3 seconds. That was all she was given. She counted them because she had nothing else. She went down the stairs. She greeted her hostess. She ate supper beside a viscount who talked exclusively about his horses and to whom she listened with perfect attention, because she was the Marchioness of Dunmore and this was her life and she had chosen it with both hands open. Across the room, Edmund did not look at her again for the rest of the evening. Not once. Not even accidentally. The effort it must have cost him, she thought, was something she preferred not to examine too closely, because if she examined it she would have to sit with the possibility that his absence of looking was not indifference but something else entirely. Something she could not afford. It was easier to believe he hated her. She let herself believe it. She was almost convinced. In London, Edmund Caldwell was building himself into something new. He threw himself into Parliament with the single-minded intensity of a man who has converted grief into fuel and intends to burn every last drop of it. He was on 3 committees by the end of 1813. He had developed a reputation for the kind of parliamentary speeches that left the opposing side slightly uncertain what had just happened to them. Quiet, precise, surgically constructed arguments that found the weak seam in the other position and pulled until the whole thing gave. He did not shout. He did not perform. He simply laid out the truth with such absolute, immovable calm that disagreeing with him became an uncomfortable act of self-exposure. People were slightly afraid of him. He preferred it that way. His sister Helena, who had been 16 in the summer he lost Rosalind and was now a young woman of 19 navigating her first season with the chaotic energy of someone who found absolutely everything interesting and everyone worth talking to, watched her brother with the quiet, worried attentiveness of someone who loves a person and does not know how to reach them anymore. "You used to laugh at dinner," she told him once. "I laugh," he said. "Edmund, you produce a sound that technically qualifies. It is not the same thing." He looked at her from across the breakfast table. She looked back at him, his eyes in her face, but warmer, the way their mothers had been warm, and she didn't press. She knew him well enough to know that pressing did nothing. She simply reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment, and then went back to her toast. He did not discuss Rosalind. Not with Helena. Not with anyone. She was a room he had sealed and moved past, and the fact that he occasionally stood outside it in the dark for a few minutes was a private matter. What was also private, what remained private for 8 years, was the afternoon in 1814 when he found the first thread. It was not deliberate. He had been reviewing a stack of parliamentary documentation that had passed through Dunmore's committee, cross-referencing some figures that didn't sit correctly, and he had found an anomaly in a secondary document. A record of correspondence that referenced letters, a set of letters describing communications with a French agent, attached to a name, and the name was his. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time with the specific, frozen attention of a man who has just understood something terrible. The letters were fabricated. He could see it immediately. Dates that didn't align, references to positions he hadn't held yet, the faint stylistic tell of a document constructed to resemble rather than to be. He had spent 3 years developing an eye for exactly this kind of parliamentary sleight of hand, and now it was pointed directly at his own name. He sat in his study for 4 hours. Dunmore had been holding this. Dunmore had built this. And Rosalind. He stopped the thought. He turned it over. He examined it from every angle he could access, which was not all of them, because there were pieces he didn't have. What he had was this: Dunmore had manufactured evidence against him. Rosalind had married Dunmore. Those 2 facts now occupied the same sentence in a way they never had before, and the architecture of everything he thought he understood about the summer of 1812 began to shift beneath his feet. He could confront Dunmore. He ran it through. Confrontation would trigger a response. Dunmore would not fold quietly. He never had. He would activate whatever else he had prepared. Rosalind's name would be dragged through proceedings. Thomas, Dunmore's heir, a child Edmund had refused to think about, would be caught in whatever explosion followed. Nothing good happened to the people near Dunmore if Dunmore was cornered. He could go to Rosalind. He held this option longer than the others. He could appear at Dunmore House and ask her, directly, if this was what had happened. He could tell her what he had found. He could. He thought about her face at the top of those stairs. The perfect composure of it. The 3 seconds she had held his gaze before he made himself turn away, because looking at her for a 4th second would have undone something that he needed to stay done. If she was protecting a secret, if this was what the marriage had been, a sacrifice made to protect him, and he appeared at her door now and blew the whole thing open, what would that accomplish? Dunmore would be damaged. Rosalind would be exposed. The life she had constructed, whatever it was, would be scattered. He could protect it instead. He buried the document. Quietly, methodically, through 3 intermediaries, he had it removed from the record it had been placed in and suppressed entirely. No proceedings. No confrontation. No one would find it there again. Then he went home and didn't sleep and told no one. He never told anyone. He held it alone for 4 years, which was, he would later understand, perhaps the loneliest thing he had ever done. The second time they were in the same room was the Pemberton Ball in 1815. She was in deep blue. He registered this from across the room and immediately registered that he was registering it and was furious with himself about both things. She was with a group of women, other parliamentary wives, the kind of gathering that passed political information more efficiently than any committee. She was laughing at something one of them had said. It was a real laugh, not the Marchioness laugh. He knew the difference. He had catalogued the difference 3 years ago, and the knowledge had sat in him like a splinter ever since. He did not approach her. She did not approach him. They acknowledged each other precisely once, at supper, with the mutual inclination of heads that London society used to communicate everything it wasn't saying. Her eyes met his for a second and a half this time. Down from 3. He counted. He hated that he counted. The 3rd time was a concert in 1817. Dunmore was beside her. This was the only occasion on which Edmund had seen them together, and he had spent the following 6 weeks systematically dismantling every parliamentary initiative Dunmore had put before the House that session, which was childish and effective and which he did not examine too carefully. The 4th time was an evening party in November of 1820, and Edmund had made it through the soup course and the fish course and most of the remove when Helena, seated beside him, said in a voice low enough for only him to hear, "She looks tired, Edmund." "I hadn't noticed," he said. "You've looked at her 11 times since we sat down. You've been counting. Somebody has to." He set down his fork. "Helena, I'm just saying that whatever she did, whatever happened, she doesn't look happy. She hasn't looked happy in 8 years. And neither have you. And you are sitting 14 feet apart in the same room making yourselves both miserable about it." She picked up her wine. "I find the whole thing very wasteful." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He could not explain to Helena what he knew and hadn't acted on and why. He could not explain the 4 years of carrying Dunmore's buried secret alone in the dark. He could not explain the 11 times he had looked across the table, or the way he had memorized the exact shade of tired in the corners of her eyes, or the fact that the composure she wore so perfectly was something he recognized because he was wearing it too and he knew what it cost. He looked at his plate. "Eat your supper, Helena," he said. She ate her supper. She didn't bring it up again that evening. But she filed it away in the private ledger she kept on her brother's well-being, and the entry she made was not good. Dunmore died in March of 1822. A fever, swift, unglamorous, entirely without the dramatic weight that a man of his particular villainy should perhaps have merited. He was ill for 9 days. He was dead on the 10th. Rosalind sat with him the last 3, not because she owed him warmth, but because she was not a woman who abandoned people to die alone regardless of what they had done to her. She held his hand on the last night. He was not conscious. She sat in the chair and looked at his face, the florid color drained out of it now, the authority gone, just an old man with his mouth slightly open, and she felt nothing she had a clean name for. Not grief. Not relief. Exactly. Something like the end of a very long sentence. He died at 4 in the morning. The doctor was summoned. The house began its mechanical transformation into mourning. Rosalind went upstairs, sat at her dressing table, looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, and then sent for Thomas. He arrived in his night clothes, sleep-rumpled, 7 years old and grave-eyed in the way he was always grave-eyed, standing in her doorway with his dark hair in every direction. "Is it father?" he said. "Yes, my love." He came and stood beside her chair. She put her arm around him. He leaned against her without crying, Thomas was not a crier, had never been a crier, had inherited from somewhere a composure that was frankly remarkable in a child, and they stayed like that for a while, in the candlelight, in the silence of the house. "What happens now?" Thomas said. "Now," Rosalind said, "we begin." She meant it as comfort. She also meant it entirely literally. Because there was a box in Dunmore's study, the solicitor had mentioned it, had been very deliberate about it, had said it was to go to her directly upon the Marquess's death, and she had not opened it yet, and she did not know what was inside it, and some part of her that had spent 10 years surviving on controlled information felt the specific dread of something she had not prepared for. She went to the study at dawn. She opened the box alone. The letters inside were in Dunmore's handwriting. 3 of them. She read the first and her hands stopped moving. She read the second and sat down in Dunmore's chair without planning to. She read the third, the unsent one, the confession, the one that rewrote 8 years of everything she thought she understood about what Edmund had known and when, and then she sat very still in her dead husband's study as the sun came up over London. Outside, a street vendor began calling his wares. A cart rattled past. The ordinary morning continued in the ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that the entire architecture of Rosalind Vane's last decade had just been quietly demolished and she was sitting in the rubble of it in a black morning gown at 6 in the morning with no earthly idea what to do next. She did what she always did. She thought it through. She reached the end of every avenue. There was only one door. She picked up the pen. "I need to explain." She sealed the letter. She sent it before she could think better of it. And then she sat and waited for the sound of a carriage on the street below, which was the most terrifying thing she had done in 10 years, including the night she signed her life away to save a man who, she understood now, finally, with perfect devastating clarity, had spent 4 years quietly saving it back. The carriage arrived on Wednesday morning. She heard the wheels on the cobblestones. She heard the footman open the front door. She heard, after a moment, the sound of footsteps crossing the marble hallway below. She stood up. The drawing-room door opened. Edmund Caldwell walked in and stopped. He looked older. Of course he did. They both did. 10 years was 10 years. It left its marks. But it was him, exactly him. The dark eyes and the angular jaw and the hair that still had its own opinions about where it wanted to be. And he was standing in her drawing-room in his riding coat looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not fully read, which had never happened. They had always been legible to each other. And the fact that she couldn't read him now told her how much distance they had put between themselves over a decade of standing on opposite sides of every room. He said nothing. She said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere upstairs, she heard Thomas's governess beginning the morning lesson, the faint, rhythmic sound of a child repeating his Latin declensions. Edmund's eyes moved to the ceiling. He listened. His jaw did something. He looked back at her. "How old?" he said. His voice was very quiet. Rosalind held his gaze. 9, she said. Edmund Caldwell had not allowed himself to feel anything in the full, unguarded sense of the word for approximately 10 years. He had managed it very well. He had built the management of it into the foundation of everything he was. That foundation developed a crack now. It was not visible. But she saw it. She saw it because she knew this face. "You should sit down," she said. "I am perfectly." Edmund. It was the first time she had said his name in 10 years. They both registered this. She saw it move through him. "Sit down." He sat down. And Thomas, at precisely that moment, finished his Latin lesson early. Because Thomas always finished early, the governess had been complaining about it for months, and came looking for his mother. The drawing-room door opened. Thomas Vane Dunmore was 9 years old and had been raised in a house where adults did not explain themselves to children, so he had developed the habit of reading rooms instead. He stood in the doorway and read this one in approximately 4 seconds. His mother was standing by the window in her black morning dress. That was not unusual. She had been wearing black for 3 weeks and standing by windows for most of it. What was unusual was the man sitting in the wingback chair by the fireplace, who had the look of someone who had arrived intending to be in command of something and had lost that intention very recently. The man's coat was good. His hands were gripping his own knees. His eyes had gone to Thomas the moment the door opened and had not moved since, which was the thing Thomas noticed most, because adults usually looked at him briefly and then looked back at whatever they considered more important. This man was not looking away. Thomas looked back. He was not intimidated by being looked at. He had lived with the Marquess of Dunmore, who had looked at everyone as though calculating their usefulness, and he had learned early that the best response to being assessed was to assess in return. He looked at the man's face. Something happened in Thomas's chest that he didn't have a word for yet. A recognition that wasn't quite recognition because he had never met this person in his life. It was like looking at something familiar in an unfamiliar place, the way you might see your own handwriting on someone else's page and think, for one disorienting moment, that you had written it. "Thomas," his mother said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. "Come in." He came in. He walked to his mother's side, which was his default position in rooms containing unknowns, and stood with his shoulder just touching her arm. "This is the Duke of Caldwell," she said. Thomas looked at the Duke of Caldwell. The Duke of Caldwell looked at Thomas. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Thomas said, because it was simply the thing he observed and Thomas had not yet learned the social architecture of not saying true things, "You have the same hands as me." He had not meant it to land the way it landed. He had noticed it as a fact, the shape of the fingers, the particular length of them, the way they rested, and said it the way he said any fact, directly and without decoration. But the Duke's face did something that Thomas had almost never seen an adult's face do in his presence. It broke open. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just a small, devastating movement around the eyes and the jaw, there and then controlled again in less than 2 seconds. But Thomas had been watching and he caught it and filed it away with the careful precision of a child who had learned that the things adults almost showed you were more important than the things they did. "Yes," the Duke said. His voice was not entirely level. "I suppose we have." Rosalind put her hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Will you go back to Miss Henshaw? I'll come up before lunch." Thomas looked at his mother. He looked at the Duke. He was 9, not an idiot. "All right," he said. He left. He pulled the door almost shut, then stopped. Through the 2-inch gap he stayed very still in the hallway for 30 seconds, listening. He heard his mother say, very quietly, "I'm sorry." He heard the Duke say nothing. Then he heard the Duke say, "Don't." Just that word. Nothing after it. Thomas went upstairs. He sat across from Miss Henshaw and conjugated Latin verbs with perfect concentration and thought about hands. Inside the drawing room, the silence between Rosalind and Edmund had the texture of something that had been building for 10 years and had finally, inevitably, arrived at its destination and didn't know what to do with itself now that it was here. Edmund stood up. He could not sit still any longer. He crossed to the window, the other window, not hers, and stood with his back to her for a moment, one hand braced against the frame. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. All of it. The card party. The fireplace. Dunmore's folded document and his pleasant voice delivering the end of everything she wanted as though he were discussing the weather. She told it without softening, without apology, without the performance of emotion. She simply laid it out in sequence, the way you lay out evidence, because that was what it was. She had been carrying it for 10 years, and now she set it down in the space between them and let it be what it was. Edmund did not move while she spoke. His hand stayed on the window frame. Outside, a child was playing in the street below, chasing something, laughing. The sound was extraordinarily incongruous. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You didn't wake me," he said. "No. You didn't leave a note." "No." He turned around. "Why?" Not with anger yet. The anger was there, she could see it in the line of his jaw, but underneath it was something rawer, something that had more of that 19-year-old Duke in it than the composed 31-year-old standing in her drawing room. "Rosalind, you could have woken me. You could have told me. We could have." "We could have what, Edmund?" She said it gently, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. "Confronted him? You would have." Immediately, that night, you would have confronted him and he would have submitted those letters by morning, and by the following week you would have been standing before a committee answering questions about correspondence that didn't exist, with no way to prove it didn't exist, Anne. "I would have found a way." You didn't know enough yet. You didn't have the connections you have now, the experience, You were 22 years old and he had been doing this for 30 years and he was very, very good at it. She stopped. I had 4 minutes to decide and I decided. And I would make the same decision again. That, Edmund said, is possibly the most infuriating thing you have ever said to me. I've been saying infuriating things to you since 1812. You used to like it. It was the wrong thing to say. Or the right thing. She wasn't sure which. Something shifted in his expression, a flash of something unguarded that he pulled back almost instantly, but not quite fast enough. He looked at her. I found it in 1814. She went very still. What? Dunmore's fabricated evidence. I found it in a parliamentary file 2 years after everything. I traced it back to him. I worked out what it was. He paused. I worked out what it probably meant. Rosalind stared at him. You buried it, she said. It came out barely above a whisper. I had it removed from the record. Edmund. What would confronting it have accomplished? Dunmore would have. You protected me. She could hear the thing in her own voice that she hadn't intended, the crack in it, small and involuntary. You knew and you said nothing and you, for 4 years you carried that. 4 years, 2 months, he said. Roughly. She sat down. It was not a graceful or composed sitting. She simply ran out of the ability to stand and the chair behind her received her without ceremony. Edmund watched her. He did not go to her. Not yet. There was still too much in the room between them, too much unsaid and said. So, she said, after a moment, we were both keeping the same secret. For 4 years. She looked up at him. We were both in the same city, at the same parties, looking at each other across the same rooms, and... Yes, he said. That is, she said, and her voice was doing something she could not entirely control. Genuinely the most. She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Tried again. I want to be very angry at you. You have every right. And I am. I am furious with you, actually. You could have come to me. You could have told me what you found and we could have. Could we? He crossed his arms. Not defensively. Like a man holding himself together. You had a son. You had a household. Dunmore was alive, and if I had appeared on your doorstep with what I knew, if he had found out I'd been in contact with you, what do you imagine he would have done with that? The answer sat between them, obvious and ugly. So we were each protecting the other, she said. Apparently. And neither of us knew. Until now. Another silence. A different quality to this one, less like a wall and more like the moment after a wall comes down, when you're standing in the rubble of it and you can finally see the ground. There's a letter, she said. In the box. He wrote it to me 6 years in and never sent it. She stopped. Found the words. He said he came to admire what I did. What I gave up. She said it carefully, like she was still working out how to hold it. He wasn't a good man. He was not. But he wasn't, at the end, there was something in him that saw it clearly. Edmund said nothing. He also wrote that you had found the evidence, she said. He knew. He'd been watching you, naturally, because that was what he did, and he discovered that you'd buried it, and he knew what that meant. She paused. He called it the most honorable thing he'd ever witnessed a man do for a woman. Which from him, from Dunmore, saying that about you, is about the most complicated thing I have ever had to sit with. Edmund uncrossed his arms. He walked slowly to the chair opposite her and sat down, and for a moment they were simply 2 people sitting across from each other in a drawing room, which was the most ordinary thing in the world and also entirely nothing like ordinary. I should have found a way to tell you, he said. His voice had lost its parliamentary precision. He sounded tired. He sounded like the 22-year-old who had stood in his bedroom at 8 in the morning and read a social note and gone to the window and put his hands flat against the glass. I told myself I was protecting you. And I was. But I was also, it was easier to carry it alone. Because if I came to you and you told me it was what I thought, then I would have to. He stopped. What? She said, very quietly. Feel it, he said. All of it. Everything I'd spent 2 years burying. Rosalind looked at him across the small distance of the drawing room. This man she had loved at 21 and remade herself not to love at 22 and failed to not love every year since. And she understood, with the completeness of knowing someone well, that he had just said the most honest thing he was capable of saying, and that it had cost him considerably. "I know," she said. "I know exactly." She sent him home at noon. Not coldly. There was no coldness left between them by that point. Just the exhausted openness of two people who had been in the same battle on opposite sides and had finally managed to stop fighting. He needed time. She needed time. Thomas needed lunch, which was the most practical concern anyone had raised all morning and which restored a small, necessary sense of the ordinary. Edmund stood in her hallway putting on his coat. He paused at the door. "He really said that," he said. "The hands." "He notices everything," Rosalind said. "He always has." Edmund looked at his hands. Then he buttoned his coat. "I'll call on Thursday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He left. She closed the door and stood in her own hallway in the silence and breathed. What happened between Wednesday and Thursday was that Helena happened. Helena Caldwell arrived at Edmund's house on Wednesday evening with the focused energy of a young woman who had been noticing things for 10 years and had decided that now was the appropriate moment to have opinions about them at volume. She found her brother in his study. She did not knock. "You went to her," she said, from the doorway. Edmund looked up from the document he had not been reading. "Good evening, Helena." "Don't good evening me in that tone. You went to Rosalind Dunmore's house this morning and you were there for 3 hours. She came in and sat down in the chair across from him without being invited, which was her consistent policy. I have it from Lady Ashworth, who had it from her footman, who had it from the Dunmore house's second kitchen made within the hour, because London has no walls and you know this, so tell me." He told her. He told her more than he had intended to. Perhaps because he had been carrying it alone for 8 years and today had cracked something open, and the telling of it to Rosalind had made a further telling possible. He told Helena about the card party and the ultimatum and what Rosalind had done and why, and about the fabricated evidence he'd found 2 years later and what he'd done with it, and about the box of letters, and Dunmore's unsent confession, and Thomas, 9 years old, dark hair, grey eyes, who had looked at him across a drawing room and said, "You have the same hands as me." Helena listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her natural mode and therefore indicated how seriously she was taking it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been furious at her for 8 years. I know. I've been, Edmund, I cut her from 3 dinner parties myself. I walked past her at the Pendleton Ball in 1818 without speaking. I told Lady Ashworth that the new Marchioness of Dunmore was not to be included in the—" She stopped. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something too large to process quickly. "She did all of that to save you." "Yes. And you knew, 4 years in, you knew and you didn't." "Helena." "No, I'm not attacking you. I need a moment." She stood up and went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, arms folded. When she turned around, her eyes were bright. She was not a crier either. It was a family characteristic, but she was very close. "Does she know? About all of it? Does she know everything?" "She knows now. And it is complicated. And it is going to take time." Helena wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist in a single decisive motion that brooked no sentimentality about itself. "Right," she said. "I'm going to call on her tomorrow morning." "Helena, I have 8 years of appalling behavior to apologize for. I'm going to do it immediately because I'm not going to spend one more day being the sort of person who walked past Rosalind Vane without speaking when she was the bravest woman in any room she ever entered." She picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. "You will not talk me out of this." He hadn't been going to try. He watched his sister, small, warm, righteous, the best of them in every way that mattered, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. "Thursday," he said. "I'm calling on Thursday." "Good," Helena said. "That gives me Wednesday evening to do the groundwork." She pointed at him on her way out. "Don't overthink it between now and then. I know what you do when you're left alone with something. You dismantle it into pieces and then you can't put it back together because you've lost the shape of it. Don't do that." She left. He sat in his study. He looked at his hands. He did not dismantle anything. Thursday arrived with grey skies and the kind of London morning that couldn't decide between rain and relenting. Edmund arrived at Rosalind's door at 11. The footman showed him to the drawing room. He waited. She came in carrying 2 cups of tea, which was not what he had expected. There was something so specifically, deliberately normal about it. 2 cups of tea, no silver tray, no ceremony, that it knocked him slightly off whatever footing he'd prepared. She handed him one. She sat down. She looked at him with those grey eyes and said, "Helena came yesterday." "I know." "She cried." "She told me she did not cry." "She cried," Rosalind said. "We both did." And then she apologized at considerable length with considerable specificity, and then she asked if she could meet Thomas, and then she cried again when I said yes. Edmund looked at his tea. "That sounds like her." "She's extraordinary," Rosalind said quietly. "She always was." A pause. "I missed her almost as much as I missed you." Almost. The word landed between them with the small, devastating weight of an almost that had been withheld for 10 years. Edmund set his cup down. He looked at her. She looked at him. The clock on the mantel did what clocks do. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Neither do I. I mean, I know what I want. That part is not the difficulty. The difficulty is that there is a decade of—" he paused, searching. "We are not the same people who stood in your aunt's garden in June of 1812. "No," she said. "We're not. And I'm not entirely sure we can begin from where we left off. I'm not asking you to." She set her own cup down. "I'm asking you to begin from here. From today. Whatever this is." She gestured between them, at the drawing room, at the tea, at the obliterated and reconstructed architecture of everything that had happened. "I'm not asking for yesterday back. I'm asking if you want today." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the London morning finally made its decision and began to rain. Before he could answer, and he had the answer, it was there. It had been there since Wednesday morning when he read 4 words on a sealed letter and knew in his blood what they meant. The drawing-room door opened and Thomas appeared in the doorway in his outdoor coat, hat in hand, apparently having escaped Miss Henshaw once again. He looked at Edmund with those steady grey eyes. "You came back," he said. "Not accusatory. Observational." "I said I would," Edmund said. Thomas considered this. He looked at his mother. He looked back at Edmund. Then he said, with the pragmatic directness of a child who had grown up in a house with no warmth and had therefore learned not to waste time approaching things sideways, "Are you going to be here often?" The room was very quiet. Edmund said, "I'd like to be, if that's agreeable to you." Thomas turned this over. He had his mother's way of thinking before speaking, that considered pause that meant the words that came out would be exactly the ones intended. "All right," he said. "But I'm not calling you father. I'll call you Caldwell. That's what Mother calls you in her head anyway." Rosalind made a sound that was very close to a laugh and pressed her fingers to her mouth. Edmund looked at Thomas. Something in his face shifted, moved through something, and arrived somewhere new. "Caldwell is fine," he said. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. He looked at his mother. "Can I go to the park if Henshaw comes?" "Yes," Rosalind said. "Boots on properly this time." He left. His footsteps went down the hall in the particular uneven rhythm of a child who is walking and not quite running because someone told him not to run indoors and he is respecting the letter of the rule if not its spirit. Edmund and Rosalind sat in the drawing room in the sound of the rain. "In my head," Edmund said. "I never claimed to be logical about everything." He looked at her. She looked at him. And there it was again, that terrible, familiar legibility, the way they had always been able to read each other before words arrived, still intact after 10 years of distance and grief and separate rooms and opposite windows, still there, apparently indestructible. He was going to say something. He had the shape of it. Then the footman knocked and entered with a card on a tray, and said that a solicitor from Mr. Hartley's offices was asking to see her ladyship at her earliest convenience regarding the Dunmore estate settlement, and that the matter had apparently become rather urgent. Edmund watched her face change, the composure returning, the Marchioness sliding into position over the woman who had just almost laughed at her son's pragmatism. "Tell him an hour," she said. The footman left. She looked at Edmund. He looked at her. "The estate," she said carefully. "There are complications with Thomas's inheritance. Dunmore's brother has made a challenge." Edmund's eyes sharpened in a way she recognized, the parliamentary focus, the instinct for a problem presenting itself. "On what grounds?" "Legitimacy," she said. And then she said nothing else, because the word sat in the room and did everything a word like that does to the air. Edmund went very still. Rosalind held his gaze. Her chin was up. Her voice was steady. But her hands, he noticed, had tightened in her lap. "They can't prove it," she said. "There's no proof. Thomas is legally Dunmore's heir and the records show." "Rosalind." He leaned forward. "Are they going to pursue it?" She breathed. "The solicitor believes they will try." Edmund stood up. He was not the 22-year-old who had stood at a window anymore. He was Edmund Caldwell, Duke of Caldwell, the man who had spent a decade turning grief into precision and precision into power, and he was looking at the first problem that had presented itself since Wednesday morning that he knew exactly how to handle. "They won't succeed," he said. She looked up at him. "You don't know that yet." "No," he said. "But I know where Dunmore's original fabricated documents are buried. I know 3 members of the committee that would hear such a challenge, and I know things about Dunmore's brother's financial conduct that he would very much prefer remained private." He picked up his coat. "Let me speak to your solicitor." "Edmund." "This is what I do, Rosalind." He looked at her directly. "Let me do it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the door, opened it and spoke to the footman in the hall. "Please tell Mr. Hartley's man that the Duke of Caldwell will join the meeting." She turned back into the room. Edmund was watching her with an expression she was still learning to read again after 10 years of not being allowed to. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said, which was exactly what he'd said on Wednesday morning when she tried to apologize, and she understood now that it was not refusal. It was something more like "we are past that now." They went into the hall together. Downstairs, the solicitor waited with his complications. Somewhere above, Thomas had presumably found his boots. Outside, London rain continued without apology. Nothing was resolved. Everything was beginning. And somewhere in the Dunmore estate papers that the solicitor had brought in his bag, buried 3 documents deep in a set of files nobody had yet thought to look at, was a letter that neither Rosalind nor Edmund knew existed, in a handwriting neither of them would immediately recognize, that was going to change the shape of everything they thought they had just understood. Again.
If this story is doing something to your chest right now, you are not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Like this video if Rosalind deserves everything that is coming to her. Subscribe because the next part is where Edmund finally says what he has been holding for 10 years, and I promise you, you are not ready. Share this with someone who needs a love story that actually earns its ending, and comment where you're watching from to see just how far our story has traveled. Let's continue with our tale.
The solicitor's name was Mr. Hartley, not the Mr. Hartley of the firm, but his nephew, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had been handed a problem significantly above his professional weight and was managing it with the determined composure of a drowning person who has decided to drown neatly. He spread the documents across the table in Rosalind's study with the careful precision of a man who understood that every paper in front of him represented a different variety of catastrophe and that the woman watching him from across the table had already assessed all of them before he arrived. Edmund stood at the window with his arms folded, reading the room the way he read parliamentary chambers, finding the exits, calculating the weak points, deciding where to apply pressure. "The challenge," young Mr. Hartley began, "comes from Mr. Gerald Dunmore, the late Marquess's younger brother. His position is that the marriage was, and I must stress this is his position, not the firm's, irregular, and that the child Thomas was born within a time frame that might, under certain readings, call into question the circumstances of his, that is to say, his." "Say it plainly," Rosalind said. Mr. Hartley looked at his papers. Gerald Dunmore is claiming that Thomas is not the late Marquess's biological son, and therefore has no legitimate claim to the title or the estate. The study was very quiet. On what evidence? Edmund said, from the window. At present, sir, he has none. His intention, as communicated through his own solicitor, a Mr. Voss, is to petition the courts to compel a review of the marriage records and the child's birth documentation, on the grounds that the marriage itself was conducted with unusual haste and that subsequent, that is to say, that Mrs. Dunmore had, prior, he looked up miserably. He intends to suggest there was a prior attachment. To me, Edmund said. Mr. Hartley arranged his face into professional neutrality and said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Rosalind had not moved. She was sitting with that perfected stillness she'd had since she was 22, the kind that wasn't calm but looked like it. Edmund watched her from across the room and saw what was underneath it. Her hands were flat on the desk. She was pressing them down. He knew what that meant. He had done the same thing at Windows for 10 years. Gerald Dunmore, Edmund said, has 3 outstanding debt notes held by a counting house on Threadneedle Street. 2 of them are past the date of calling. He is also, and this is somewhat more delicate, a member of a private club in St. James's that has recently come to the attention of certain parliamentary colleagues of mine for conduct I would characterize as legally unfortunate. He paused. Does he know that I am involved in this matter? Mr. Hartley blinked. No, sir. Not as yet. Then he doesn't know what he's walked into, Edmund said. Give me 48 hours. Rosalind looked at him. Edmund, this has to be done correctly. If you apply pressure and it's traced back to... It won't be traced back to anything. I've been doing this for 9 years. He picked up one of the estate documents from the table and read it for a moment. Set it down. His claim requires a hearing. A hearing requires a petition. A petition requires a solicitor willing to submit it. If Gerald Dunmore's solicitor were to discover that his client's financial situation was about to become a matter of public record, he might reconsider the wisdom of drawing further legal attention to his affairs. He looked at Mr. Hartley. Professionally speaking. Mr. Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was having is not the conversation that is actually occurring. I see. Yes. I believe I understand. Good, Edmund said. Now, there were other documents in the Marquess's estate. Files. I'd like to see the complete inventory. Mr. Hartley reached into his bag and produced a handwritten list. Edmund took it. He read through it once, then went back to the 3rd page and stopped. This, he said, and pointed to a line. Mr. Hartley looked. Ah. Yes. That's. We weren't entirely sure what to make of it. It was in a separate box, sealed, not part of the organized estate files. It came to us from the Dunmore solicitor's office, a Mr. Cawthon, who managed certain of the late Marquess's more private arrangements. He included it without explanation. Who is it addressed to? Mr. Hartley looked slightly uncomfortable. That's the unusual thing, sir. It's addressed to no one. It has no addressee and no date. It appears to be a letter that was written without an intended recipient. He reached into the bag again and produced a sealed envelope. Plain. Heavy paper. The wax unbroken. He held it toward Rosalind. She took it. She looked at it. On the front, in Dunmore's handwriting, that precise, controlled copperplate she had watched sign parliamentary briefs for 9 years, were 2 words. Tell him. She went completely still. Edmund crossed the room in 4 steps. He looked over her shoulder at the envelope. Read the 2 words. His jaw tightened. I'll give you a moment, Mr. Hartley said, with the professional sensitivity of a man who has learned to read the air in difficult rooms, and excused himself into the hallway with quiet efficiency. Rosalind held the envelope without opening it. Edmund stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which was something she had not allowed herself to notice on Wednesday or Thursday and was less successful at ignoring today. Open it, he said. I'm aware that's what one does with letters, she said. Rosalind. She broke the seal. The letter inside was 2 pages. Dunmore's handwriting, but different from the other letters, less controlled, written faster, the pen pressed harder into the page in places. She read it. Edmund read it beside her. Neither of them spoke. Dunmore had written it approximately a year before he died, by the internal references. He had written it knowing he was not well. There were mentions of the doctor, of arrangements being put in order. He had written it knowing he would not send it, because he had put it in a sealed box with a sealed envelope and told his solicitor to include it in the estate documents without explanation, which was the action of a man who had decided to let something be known after he was no longer present to manage the consequences. The first page was what they had already known and slightly more. He confirmed the ultimatum. He confirmed the fabricated evidence. He confirmed that he had known, by 1816, that Edmund had found and buried the documents, and that he had watched Edmund do it and understood what it meant. He wrote it without apology, not because he didn't have the capacity, she thought, but because he had decided apology was insufficient and honesty was the only currency that remained. The second page was what neither of them had known. Dunmore had, in 1818, received a private approach from Gerald, his own brother, proposing a scheme. Gerald had come to him with information he claimed to have discovered about the circumstances of the marriage, suggesting that if Dunmore were to arrange his will in Gerald's favour, Gerald would keep quiet about it. If not, Gerald intended to use the information after Dunmore's death to challenge Thomas's legitimacy and invalidate the inheritance. Dunmore had told his brother to get out of his house. He had then spent the following 4 years quietly and methodically constructing legal protections around Thomas's inheritance with a thoroughness that his estate solicitors had considered excessive at the time and would, he wrote, soon understand the purpose of. He enumerated every protection, every document, every legal instrument he had put in place specifically to ensure that when Gerald attempted his challenge, and Dunmore had known, with complete certainty, that Gerald would attempt it, he would find every door already locked, every avenue already closed, every argument already answered in a court filing somewhere with an earlier date. He had spent 4 years protecting Thomas from beyond the grave. At the bottom of the second page, after the legal enumeration, there were 3 additional lines. Shorter, the handwriting more careful, as if he had thought about them for a long time before writing them. The boy is better than I deserved. She is better than I deserved. I made one good decision in this matter. I told Gerald no. It is not enough to balance the account. But it is what I have. Tell him. It will be better for Thomas if Caldwell knows all of it before the challenge comes. He will handle it correctly. He always does. Rosalind set the letter down on the desk. She did not trust her voice for a moment. She waited until she did. Well, she said. Edmund said nothing. He picked up the letter and read the last 3 lines again. His expression was the one she still hadn't fully decoded, the one that had arrived on Wednesday and didn't match any of the faces he'd shown the world in the decade between. He spent 4 years protecting Thomas, she said. Yes. From his own family. Yes. While Thomas didn't know he existed and I was in this house managing a man I didn't love and you were in Mayfair managing a decade of, she stopped. This is the most complicated grief I have ever been asked to feel. Edmund put the letter down. He turned to face her. He was not a good man. No. He did one good thing in a series of very bad ones. Yes. That doesn't. I know, she said. I know it doesn't. I'm not forgiving him. I'm just, she looked at the letter. I'm exhausted. I've been exhausted since March, and before that I was exhausted since 1812, and I'm very tired of understanding things about a man who cost me everything and then apparently spent his last years trying to quietly repair what he could without ever once saying so directly. Edmund sat down in the chair beside her. Not across from her, the way he had been sitting for the past 2 days, beside her. Close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. Thomas is protected, he said. Yes. Gerald has nothing. According to Dunmore's letter. I'll verify every instrument personally. Today. He paused. And then I'm going to go and have a very quiet conversation with Gerald Dunmore about the state of his finances and his club memberships. Rosalind looked at him. You are frightening when you're calm. I've been told. I used to find it alarming. Now I find it. She stopped herself. He looked at her. What? Reassuring, she said. Carefully. As if the word was being offered rather than stated. He held her gaze. And there it was again, that language they had never needed to learn because they had simply always spoken it. The one that lived in the 3 seconds she'd allowed herself at every party for 10 years. The one Thomas had apparently identified by the age of 9 on the basis of shared hand structure and 30 minutes of observation. The door opened. Mr. Hartley reappeared, judging the pause with reasonable accuracy, carrying a second document he had apparently located in his bag while exiled to the hallway. Edmund stood up. He was already calculating, already moving forward, the way he moved through all problems, methodically, without wasted motion. He took Mr. Hartley's document and began reading it standing up, asking questions in his low, precise voice that Mr. Hartley answered with increasing confidence because being asked good questions by a competent person was significantly less terrible than sitting alone with one's own inadequacy. Rosalind watched him work. She had watched men perform competence in her drawing rooms and her ballrooms and her late husband's parliamentary dinners for 10 years. What Edmund did was not performance. It was just him, the same earnest 22-year-old who had lain awake thinking about crop rotation, now 31 and turned into something formidable by circumstance and choice, standing in her study dismantling Gerald Dunmore's legal strategy with the calm efficiency of a man who finds this sort of thing genuinely manageable. She thought, not for the first time and not quietly enough to be comfortable about it, that she had loved him continuously since a warm April night in 1812 and had simply been storing it somewhere unavailable for 10 years, and that the storage facility was no longer functioning and she had no idea what to do about the overflow. She picked up her tea and found it cold. Edmund dealt with Gerald Dunmore on Friday. He did not go alone. He brought his solicitor, a man named Carrick who had the mild, pleasant demeanor of someone's favorite uncle and the legal instincts of a particularly patient shark. They arrived at Gerald Dunmore's London house at 10 in the morning and were shown into his study, where Gerald, a shorter, fleshier version of his late brother, with the same pale eyes but none of the intelligence behind them, received them with the wary hospitality of a man who has been expecting something and is not sure which shape it has taken. Edmund sat down. He laid 3 documents on the desk between them. Then he sat back and said nothing and let Gerald read them. Gerald read them. His colour changed as he went, from its natural ruddy tone through something approaching grey, settling eventually on a particular shade of mottled that suggested his body was having a disagreement with his face about the appropriate response. The first document, Edmund said pleasantly, is a full accounting of your outstanding debt obligations, including the 2 notes currently past date at Threadneedle Street. The second is a parliamentary committee report currently in preparation regarding the conduct of membership at a certain St. James's establishment. I've highlighted the sections that would be of particular relevance to you. The third is a summary of the legal instruments the late Marquess installed in his estate documentation beginning in 1818, specifically constructed to answer every argument your solicitor has briefed you to raise. Gerald set the third document down. Caldwell, he said, and his voice was doing its best to find its brother's authority and failing. You have no standing in this matter. I have every standing, Edmund said. I am the child's father. The room went very still. Edmund had not planned to say it. It had not been a tactical decision. It was not the kind of thing you deployed tactically, though the effect of it in the room was not unlike a very well-timed parliamentary move. It was simply the truth, stated in the flat, certain way he stated truths. He said it and sat in it without flinching. Gerald stared at him. Then you've made my case for me. No, Edmund said. I've made mine. Thomas is legally Dunmore's heir. Every instrument your brother put in place says so, and your brother was extremely thorough. What I've told you simply means that I have a personal interest in ensuring those instruments hold, which means that anything you pursue through the courts, I will contest with the full force of every connection and resource I possess. He folded his hands on the desk. And I have rather a lot of them. Gerald looked at the documents. He looked at Edmund. He looked at Carrick, who smiled the mild smile of a man who has heard better arguments from more formidable opponents. What do you want? Gerald said. I want your solicitor to withdraw the petition, Edmund said. Today. Quietly. I want no further legal action against the Dunmore estate, Thomas's title, or his mother's position. In exchange, the documents on this desk remain private. A pause. And if I don't? Edmund looked at him with a particular stillness he had developed over a decade of making people in rooms understand that the conversation was not going the way they hoped. "Then," Edmund said, "it becomes an interesting morning for everyone." Gerald withdrew the petition by noon. Edmund did not go back to Rosalind's house that day. He sent a note through Carrick informing her the matter was resolved and the instruments held. He needed, he had decided, 1 day of distance. 1 day in which he was not sitting across from her or beside her or reading Dunmore's letters over her shoulder, because he had told Gerald Dunmore the truth in a room that morning, and the truth had certain implications that required him to think before he acted on them. He had been telling himself, for 4 days, that this was going carefully and that careful was correct and that Rosalind deserved careful after everything. This was true. He believed it. He was also 31 years old, and he had been in love with the same woman since he was 22, and he had spent a significant portion of the last decade standing at windows, and he was finding careful increasingly difficult to maintain in her actual presence. He went home. He changed. He rode in the park for an hour in the grey afternoon with the focused intention of a man who is using physical activity to prevent himself from making decisions at speed. Helena was waiting for him when he got back. She was sitting in his drawing room drinking his tea and reading the Morning Post with her feet tucked up on his favourite chair in a way that she had been doing since she was 14 and showed no sign of stopping. "The petition's been withdrawn," she said, without looking up. "How do you know that?" "Lady Ashworth." "Helena, I dealt with this 2 hours ago." "London," she said, turning a page. "No walls." She looked up. "How is she?" He sat down. He put his head back against the chair. "She is," he stopped. Found the honest answer. "She is the same as she always was. Exactly the same. Like 10 years is a coat she took off." Helena set the paper down. She watched her brother with a careful, knowing attention she had been applying to him for a decade. "And you?" "I told Gerald this morning that I am Thomas's father." Helena went completely still. "You told Gerald Dunmore." It was relevant to the proceedings. "Edmund." "He won't say anything. He has significant incentive to be discreet." "That is not." Helena stood up. She was small enough that standing up did not give her any particular physical authority over him, but she had long since learned to project it anyway. "Edmund. You cannot. You said it to a man in a legal dispute and you haven't said it to her." He looked at the ceiling. "Oh," Helena said. She sat back down. "You haven't told her that you said it." "She'll know by tomorrow." "London. No walls." "Edmund, this is not how you," she stopped herself. "Started again. You have been waiting 10 years and you are somehow still managing to go at approximately the wrong speed. You understand that?" "I'm going carefully." "You are going at the speed of a man who is terrified," she said. "Not unkindly. With precision. Which I understand, truly, but you are both terrified and you are both rebuilding from rubble and you are taking turns being brave about it instead of being brave at the same time, and at some point one of you has to just—" She made a gesture that encompassed everything she couldn't put into a sentence. He looked at her for a long moment. "She said she missed you almost as much as she missed me," he said. "Almost." Helena pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes went bright again. "I'm going to say something embarrassing." "Please don't." "I love her," Helena said, through the hand. "I have always loved her. Even when I was furious at her, I loved her. Tell her that." "I'll tell her a number of things. Tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. He reached for his coat. Helena watched him with the expression of someone who has been hoping for a specific outcome for 8 years and has finally seen it appearing on the horizon. "Caldwell," she called after him, as he crossed the hall. He stopped. "Don't rehearse it," she said. "Whatever you're planning to say, don't rehearse it." He looked at his sister. She was grinning at him with her whole face, the way she had grinned at things since she was 4 years old, completely without armor. "When have I ever rehearsed anything?" he said. 1813. Your address on the Reform Bill. You rehearsed it 47 times. That is completely different. "Go," she said, waving him away with the newspaper. "Go." He arrived at Rosalind's house at 6:30. The footman showed him up without any indication of surprise, which meant she had left instructions. He did not examine what that meant too closely because he had promised Helena he wouldn't dismantle things. She was in the small sitting room at the back of the house, not the formal drawing room where they had been conducting the careful business of their reconstruction, but a smaller, warmer room that looked onto the garden. She was not in her morning black. She was in a dark green dress, the color of deep water, and she was not performing composure. She was just sitting, with a book open in her lap that she had clearly not been reading, and she looked up when he came in and did not try to arrange her face into anything other than what it was. He noticed immediately, and catalogued it, and felt something give way in his chest. He sat across from her. She closed the book. "Carrick's note came at 3, she said. "Gerald's withdrawn everything." "Yes." "Thank you." She paused. "And then Lady Pendleton called at 4 and informed me, in what she clearly believed was an act of catastrophic gossip rather than great kindness, that the Duke of Caldwell had told Gerald Dunmore this morning that he was Thomas's father." Edmund met her gaze. He did not look away. He had decided on the ride over that he was finished looking away from things. "I wasn't going to deny it in a room where denying it handed him leverage," he said. "I know." She held his look steadily. "That's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the garden had gone grey in the early evening light. A bird was doing something persistent in the hedge. "When you said it to Gerald," she said, "was it tactical?" Edmund let the question sit for a beat. He thought about Helena's instruction. He did not rehearse. He said the thing that was true. "No," he said. Rosalind looked at him. Something moved through her face, something she had been holding at careful distance for 4 days and had apparently run out of the infrastructure to keep holding. "Edmund, I have been in love with you since June of 1812, he said, not with the controlled quietness of his parliamentary voice. In his actual voice, which was different, rougher, less managed. I stopped pretending otherwise sometime around 1815 and simply maintained the pretense for everyone else. Including you. Including myself, occasionally, when I was particularly well rested." He paused. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I am not rushing this because it deserves not to be rushed. But I am not going to sit in another room with you and have us both pretend that I am here only because of Gerald Dunmore or Dunmore's letters or Thomas's inheritance. I am here because there has not been a single day in 10 years when I have not been entirely aware that you exist and where. The bird in the hedge stopped. The sitting room was completely quiet. Rosalind Vane had held herself together through a forced marriage and 9 years of the wrong life and a husband's death and a box of letters that restructured the architecture of everything she thought she'd understood and a legal challenge and 4 days of rebuilding something enormous with bare hands. She had not cried through any of it. She was not built for crying in front of people. She cried now. It was not the dramatic variety. It was very quiet and she pressed her fingers to her mouth almost immediately and looked at the ceiling. But it was there and it was real, and Edmund, who had been sitting across from her, was across the room in approximately 3 steps. He sat beside her. He did not put his arms around her. He took her hand, the way he had taken her hand at 9:19 in Lady Ashworth's ballroom, without ceremony, simply because it was the thing to do, and he held it and said nothing. She pressed her other hand to her eyes and breathed. "I have also been in love with you," she said, after a moment, "since June of 1812. In case that wasn't evident." "It was somewhat evident," he said. "I managed it very poorly. We both managed it very poorly." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. She lowered her hand from her eyes. She looked at him, properly, without distance, without the 10 years of careful management between them. "What do we do now?" she said. "Now," he said, "we do it correctly." "And what does that mean?" "It means I'll call on you. Regularly. And openly. It means I'll take Thomas to the park on Saturdays because he told Helena he would be amenable to this, and Helena told me within 4 minutes of him saying it, which is the fastest I have ever received intelligence on any subject." He paused. "And you let me. And we do it slowly, because it is the right speed, and because Thomas is 9 and deserves to understand what is happening rather than having it happen at him." She looked at him. He already understands, she said. He told Miss Henshaw this morning that the Duke of Caldwell was going to be a fixture. Edmund blinked. A fixture. His word. She was very impressed by it. He looked down at their joined hands. "His remarkable," he said, and the simplicity of it, the quiet, amazed quality of it, made something move through her chest she had no clean name for. "He is," she said. "He's also already told me he wants to learn to box, which I suspect will become your problem at some point." Edmund looked up. The thing in his face, the one she had been relearning for 4 days, had resolved into something clearer and steadier. Almost like the man who had stood at Lady Ashworth's ball and rehearsed his approach for 40 minutes and then abandoned the rehearsal, walking across the floor toward her with nothing prepared and everything intended. "I would like to be the kind of problem," he said carefully, "that is permanent." The words landed in the room with all the weight of 10 years of waiting behind them. She held his gaze. She was not performing composure now. She was simply being what she was, the woman who had made the hardest decision of her life at 3 in the morning and carried it without apology, who had built a life out of the wreckage of the one she wanted, who had loved him continuously through every ballroom and every pointed exclusion and every window she had stood at in the wrong house. "Good," she said. "Then stay for supper." Edmund almost smiled. It was the real kind, the kind that reached everything, that had been in cold storage since approximately 1812 and had apparently survived the decade in reasonable condition. "Just supper." "For now," she said. "We said we were going slowly." "We did." "We also said we were doing it correctly." "We did." "Then stay for supper," she said. "And on Saturday you can take Thomas to the park. And after that?" "After that," he said, "we'll see." She did not let go of his hand. From upstairs came the sound of Thomas, finished with his evening lessons, apparently engaged in some sort of conflict with his boots that was producing significant noise. The governess's voice floated down in tones of long-suffering patience. Something fell over. Thomas said something in response that was almost certainly not appropriate Latin. Edmund and Rosalind sat in the small sitting room in the evening light, hand in hand, listening to the sounds of the house around them, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing needed saying. Then Rosalind said, very quietly, "I'm going to need to speak to Thomas." "I know. About all of it. In the right way, at the right time, at his pace." "I know. He's going to have questions." "He'll have excellent questions," Edmund said. "He identified us by our hands." She exhaled, something between a laugh and a breath. "He'll want to know why you weren't there." "Yes. And I'll have to explain it." "We'll explain it," Edmund said. "Together, when he's ready. We'll tell him the truth in the version that a 9-year-old can carry without it being too heavy." He paused. "And then when he's older, the full version." She looked at their hands again. "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about very little else since Wednesday," he said. Outside, the London evening settled into itself. Somewhere down the street a dinner party was arriving in carriages, the sound of it carrying through the window, wheels on stone, voices, laughter, the ordinary magnificent machinery of the world continuing. Rosalind stood. She did not drop his hand. She simply stood, and he stood with her, and she led him toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has finally, after 10 years, arrived somewhere she intends to stay. In the hallway she called for the footman and told him to set another place at supper. Upstairs, Thomas had apparently resolved his dispute with the boots and was now demanding to know what was for dinner. Edmund listened to his son's voice carrying through the ceiling of a house that was, slowly and without ceremony, beginning to become his. He had spent 10 years building himself into something formidable out of the raw material of losing her. He understood now, standing in her hallway with her hand still in his, that everything he had built was still there, and that it would be considerably more useful with somewhere to bring it home to. He stayed for supper. He was, eventually, persuaded to stay rather longer than that. And Thomas, who finished his supper early as he finished everything early, and who was permitted to remain at the table because Rosalind decided some occasions warranted bending the rule, sat across from Edmund Caldwell with his grey eyes and his dark hair and his inherited composure and announced, without preamble, that he intended to learn to box. "I know," Edmund said. Thomas looked at him. Mother told you. Your governess told Helena who told me. Thomas considered this information about the intelligence network apparently operating around him. All right, he said, apparently deciding to file this away for future reference. Saturday. Edmund looked at Rosalind across the table. She looked back at him with those silver-grey eyes and the mouth that smiled precisely as much as she chose to let it and everything else she had stopped trying to conceal. Saturday, Edmund said. Thomas nodded. He ate his peas. He said nothing else. But when the footman came to clear the plates, Edmund caught the boy looking at him with an expression that was, unmistakably, satisfied. In the way of a 9-year-old who had walked into a drawing room and assessed the situation in 4 seconds and arrived at a conclusion that was taking the adults considerably longer to reach. The dinner ended. The evening did not. And somewhere across London, in a house on Portman Square, Helena Caldwell was reading the same evening edition of the Morning Post that she had been pretending to read for 3 hours, waiting for a message that arrived at 9:30 in Edmund's handwriting containing 4 words. Staying for supper. She read it twice. Then she smiled, the full smile, the one that crinkled her eyes, and poured herself another cup of tea and thought that supper was, all things considered, an excellent beginning. London noticed, because London always noticed, and London was constitutionally incapable of noticing quietly. It began with small things. The Duke of Caldwell calling on the Dowager Marchioness of Dunmore on a Thursday morning. Understandable, people said, given that he was apparently assisting with the estate complications. Then again on Saturday. Then again on the following Tuesday. Then there was the matter of the park, which 3 separate people witnessed independently and reported with the breathless urgency of individuals who understood they were in possession of significant social currency. The Duke of Caldwell. In Hyde Park. On a Saturday morning. Teaching a 9-year-old boy to hold his fists correctly. The boy with the dark Caldwell hair and the Dunmore title. The Dowager Marchioness sitting on a bench 12 feet away, apparently reading a book, which she had not turned a page of in 40 minutes. Lady Ashworth, who had witnessed this scene personally from her own morning ride, went home and cancelled every other engagement she had that day in order to dedicate the afternoon fully to the project of telling everyone she knew. By Monday, the Ton had a narrative. By Wednesday, the narrative had subdivisions and competing theories. By the following Friday, it had reached the attention of Lady Pendleton, who was the apex predator of London gossip in the specific sense that nothing became truly real until she had pronounced upon it, and Lady Pendleton had been observed at 3 separate gatherings expressing an opinion that could be characterized, depending on how generously you read her, as either cautious approval or the kind of pointed neutrality that meant she was waiting to see which way it settled before committing. Rosalind was aware of all of it. She had spent 9 years as the Marchioness of Dunmore, which meant she had spent 9 years as a target of exactly this kind of attention, and she had developed both the intelligence network and the temperament to manage it. She read it the way she read everything, precisely, without flinching, and then decided what she was going to do about it. What she did was go to Lady Pendleton's Wednesday afternoon card party. She had not been invited to Lady Pendleton's Wednesday afternoon card party since 1813. The invitation that arrived on Monday, delivered by hand, the good paper, Lady Pendleton's own seal, was not accidental, and Rosalind did not treat it as such. She dressed with the same careful intention she brought to everything, in a deep plum gown that was not quite morning and not quite not morning, which was precisely the line she needed to walk, and she arrived exactly 7 minutes after the start time, which communicated awareness of her own importance without the rudeness of lateness. Lady Pendleton received her in the front drawing-room. She was 81, small, white-haired, and possessed of the social authority of a woman who had been in the room for every significant event in London society for 60 years and remembered all of them with perfect accuracy. She looked at Rosalind for a long moment. "You look," she said, "considerably better than you have at any point in the last 10 years. "I'm sleeping more soundly," Rosalind said. "I imagine you are." Lady Pendleton gestured at the chair beside her. "Sit. Tell me absolutely nothing I haven't already heard, and I shall tell you what the room thinks, and we shall decide together what to do about it." Rosalind Saturday. She told her nothing Lady Pendleton hadn't heard. Lady Pendleton told her what the room thought, which was varied and in several cases imaginative. Then she folded her small, ring-heavy hands in her lap and said, with the directness of a woman who had not got to 81 by being delicate, "The boy. Is he Caldwell's?" A beat. Then Rosalind said, "Yes." Lady Pendleton nodded once. "And the marriage to Dunmore was not a choice I made freely." Another nod. Slower. "I suspected something of the kind at the time. The speed of it. The unlike you." She looked at Rosalind with eyes that had watched a great deal of human behavior and were not easily deceived. "Caldwell is dealing with Gerald Dunmore's challenge. He has dealt with it. It's resolved. And the two of you," Rosalind held her gaze, "are proceeding." Lady Pendleton looked at her for another moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and reached out and patted Rosalind's hand once, the way very old women sometimes do when words are less efficient than touch. "Good," she said. "Dunmore was a useful man, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I never liked him. Something behind the eyes." She picked up her cards. "Now, you will sit beside me this afternoon, and you will hold your head at exactly that height, and you will let the room look at you and make its peace with the situation. Can you do that?" "I've been doing that since I was 22, Rosalind said. Lady Pendleton smiled, a small, sharp thing that explained a great deal about how she had survived 60 years at the center of this world. "Yes," she said. "I know. You were rather wasted as Dunmore's wife." She began to deal. "Let's see if Caldwell deserves you." Saturday came around again, and with it the park, and Edmund arrived at the house at 10 to find Thomas already in his coat and boots and standing in the hallway with the focused readiness of a small general awaiting deployment. "You're early," Edmund said. "I was ready at 9, Thomas said. "Miss Henshaw made me wait." "Miss Henshaw is correct. 9 o'clock is unreasonable." Thomas looked at him with the expression of someone who fundamentally disagreed but was choosing strategic silence. Edmund had learned in the past 2 weeks that Thomas had a very sophisticated relationship with strategic silence for a 9-year-old, which was either an inherited trait or an acquired survival mechanism from growing up in Dunmore's house, and he tried not to examine too closely which one it was. They went to the park. The October morning was cold and bright, the kind of London autumn day that arrived occasionally as if to remind the city that it was capable of beauty when it tried. The leaves on the trees along the Serpentine were doing their annual performance in amber and gold. Thomas did not notice the leaves. Thomas had identified a section of path that was private enough for boxing instruction and was already in position. "Feet wider," Edmund said. "Like this." He demonstrated. Thomas adjusted. He had Rosalind's quickness, the way she took in information and immediately applied it without needing it repeated. Edmund noticed this and filed it beside every other thing he had been unconsciously cataloguing about this child for 2 weeks, the accumulating inventory of a man who had not expected to love someone this fast and was finding that the speed of it was not something he could manage the way he managed everything else. "And then," Thomas said. "And then you wait," Edmund said. "Boxing is mostly waiting." Thomas looked deeply unimpressed with this answer. "The person who moves first usually loses," Edmund said. "Patience is the technique." Thomas turned this over. "Like Parliament." Edmund stopped. "Where did you hear about Parliament?" "Mother reads the parliamentary reports. She says you're the best speaker in the House." He said it with the absolute matter-of-factness of someone reporting established fact rather than complimenting, which was somehow more effective than any deliberate compliment would have been. Edmund looked at his son. "Your mother said that," he said. "She says it as if it's annoying," Thomas said. "But she smiles after." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at the path ahead of them, the leaves, the cold bright morning. He thought about Rosalind reading parliamentary reports in a house she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't chosen, following the career of a man she'd given it all up for, alone. "Thomas," he said, "can I ask you something?" Thomas looked up. "Are you all right?" Edmund said, "With all of this? With me being here?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it apparently warranted. This was another thing Edmund had catalogued. The boy didn't dismiss things. He thought about them and answered honestly. "Miss Henshaw says it's unusual," he said. "It is, somewhat. She says people will talk about it." "They will. They already are." Mother says people talked about her the whole time she was married to father, and it didn't stop anything important from happening. He paused. She means you. I think she means you were the important thing. Edmund stood very still. Thomas looked at him with those grey eyes that had seen entirely too much for 9 years and were somehow still clear. I know what you are, he said. I knew when you came the first time. I'm not. I don't mind. I minded when father was alive that he was cold. I minded that the house was cold. I don't mind this. He said it with the directness of a child who has been told the truth carefully and has decided to respond in kind. I just need it to stay. Edmund crouched down so he was level with him. He looked at Thomas, his own jaw, Rosalind's eyes, something that was neither of them and entirely itself, and said, It will stay. Thomas looked back at him, assessing. Then he nodded, once, with the finality of someone closing a negotiation. All right, he said. Now show me the footwork again. Edmund stood. He showed him the footwork again. November arrived, and with it the question of what exactly they were, which neither Edmund nor Rosalind had put into specific language and which the Tun was absolutely not willing to leave unaddressed indefinitely. It was Helena who precipitated things, as Helena tended to precipitate things, not through interference but through the kind of cheerful, pointed honesty that was more effective than interference because it was harder to deflect. She came for tea on a Tuesday, sat across from Rosalind in the small back sitting room that had become the room where everything real happened in this house, and said, He's going to ask you something. Rosalind set down her cup. Helena. I'm not telling you anything I shouldn't. I'm just, he has the look. The one he gets before he does something significant. He had it before his Reform Bill speech in 1813, he had it before he bought his Shropshire estate in 1816, and he has it now when he thinks no one is watching him. She picked up her own cup. I thought you should know. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, November rain made its steady argument against the glass. We said we were going slowly. You've been corresponding daily, he calls 3 times a week, he takes Thomas to the park every Saturday and stayed for dinner twice last week and once the week before, Helena said pleasantly. That is a remarkable amount of slow. It's been 6 weeks. It's been 10 years and 6 weeks, Helena said. Which is a different calculation. She set her cup down. She looked at Rosalind with a warm directness that had made Rosalind love her since the first time they had properly talked, at an evening party in 1812, before everything. Are you afraid? The word sat in the room. Yes, Rosalind said. Of what, specifically? She thought about it. She had not let herself think about it directly, because thinking about things directly was something she did with estate documents and parliamentary reports, not with the parts of herself that had been carefully sealed since she was 22. But Helena was asking, and Helena had cried in this room 6 weeks ago and apologized for 8 years with the specific sincerity of someone who is also not built for apology but is doing it anyway, and Rosalind owed her the honest answer. That we've built something on the wreckage, she said. That the wreckage is still there underneath and eventually we'll feel it. She paused. That I've been performing this life for so long that I don't entirely know what it looks like when it's real. Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you know what Edmund did the morning after the first Saturday in the park? Rosalind shook her head. He came home, Helena said, and he sat in his study, and he wrote Thomas a letter. Formally. On the good paper with the Caldwell seal. Addressed to Master Thomas Vane Dunmore. He wrote him, I didn't read it, I want to be clear, he told me about it. He wrote him a letter explaining, in terms appropriate for a 9-year-old, who he was and what he hoped for and what he was asking. He gave Thomas the option to set the pace. He asked permission. Her voice had gone soft. He posted it the same day. Thomas received it the following morning and apparently read it 4 times and then put it in his desk drawer and locked it. Miss Henshaw told me he checks it's still there before bed. Rosalind looked at her hands. That, Helena said, is what it looks like when it's real. Edmund came on Thursday. He came at 11, which was his usual time, and Rosalind received him in the small sitting room, which was where they always were now. There was tea. There was the ordinary comfort of 2 people who had relearned each other's rhythms. She handed him the cup without asking. He sat in the right chair, they were already past the stage of performing ease and simply at ease. They talked about Thomas first, because they always talked about Thomas first. The boxing was progressing. Thomas had informed Edmund on Saturday that he intended to read every parliamentary report from the last decade, which Edmund had managed to respond to without any change of expression, while internally understanding that this was going to be a very interesting 15 years. Thomas had also begun signing his letters he now wrote Edmund between Saturdays, short, formal, improving in their warmth by small increments, as T. Vane Dunmore Caldwell, which no one had asked him to do and which Edmund had read standing in his hallway and then sat down on the stairs with his elbows on his knees and stayed there for quite some time. They talked about Helena, who was apparently navigating a matter with a certain Lord Ashby that she was refusing to discuss and discussing constantly through the medium of refusing to discuss it. They talked about the parliamentary session beginning in January and what Edmund intended to propose regarding inheritance reform, which Rosalind had opinions about that she delivered with the directness she had always used with him, and he listened the way he had always listened, as if her thoughts were data he genuinely needed. And then there was a pause. A different quality to it. Edmund set his cup down. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. She held herself very still. Not the Marchioness stillness, the real kind. The kind that was simply her, sitting in a room being very aware of her own heartbeat. "Before I ask it," he said, "I want to say something. Because I have been accused, with some accuracy, of saying important things too late and too quietly, and I am attempting to correct that tendency." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "I spent 10 years converting everything I felt for you into something functional. Fury first, then numbness, I suppose, and then the discovery in 1814, and that became something else entirely, something I had no clean name for, because I was furious at what had been done to you and furious at myself for not preventing it and furious that protecting you meant continuing to be without you." He paused. "I was not graceful about any of it. I was not particularly kind to people who reminded me of it accidentally, and I was not the man I wanted to be during those years. I was a good parliamentarian. I was a poor brother. I was occasionally a frightening dinner companion." Helena mentioned the dinner companions. "I imagine she did." He looked down at his hands briefly, then back at her. "What I'm trying to say, badly, as it turns out, despite the significant amount of time I have had to consider it, is that I am sorry. Not for protecting you, not for burying the evidence. Those I would do again without hesitation. I am sorry for the 4 years when I knew and said nothing and stood in rooms with you and let the distance between us stand when I could have." He stopped. "I told myself it was protection. Some of it was. Some of it was cowardice. I need you to know I know the difference." Rosalind looked at him. He was sitting across from her in the November morning light, the most honest she had ever seen him look, which was saying something because he had never, in her experience, been dishonest. He had been withheld. There was a difference, and he understood it now, and the understanding was written plainly on his face. "Edmund," she said, "let me finish. You're not the only one who should be apologizing. I know, but I'm going first." He looked at her steadily. "I want to marry you. That is the thing I want to ask. Not because of Thomas, though Thomas is. He is extraordinary, and I want to be present for the entirety of the extraordinary person he is becoming. Not because of the estate or the title or anything the Ton has decided about us. Because I have wanted to marry you since June of 1812, and the decade between was not what either of us chose, and I would like to stop measuring time in terms of what we've lost and begin measuring it in terms of what comes next." He paused. "That is the question. You don't have to answer it now. You can answer it whenever you're ready. Whenever it feels right. I'm not going anywhere." The fire in the grate made its quiet sound. The rain continued outside. Somewhere in the house, distantly, Thomas was conducting his morning lessons, and Miss Henshaw's voice carried faintly through the ceiling in the rhythm of someone who has been outpaced by their student and is maintaining dignity about it. Rosalind looked at Edmund Caldwell, at the dark eyes and the angular jaw and the slightly crooked nose and the hair that still had its opinions, and felt the whole weight of 10 years settle and lift simultaneously, the way very heavy things do when they are finally, after a long time, set down somewhere they were always meant to go. "Now," she said. He blinked. "Now." "The answer is now," she said. I'm not waiting for a more appropriate moment. I have waited for appropriate moments since I was 22 years old, and I am through with them." She looked at him directly. "Yes, Edmund. Obviously yes. It has been yes since your aunt's garden in 1812, and it is yes now, and you are the most intelligent man I know, and somehow it took you 10 years and a box of letters to work out a question I've been answering in every room we've shared since the moment I met you." He looked at her. "Obviously yes," he said. "Don't make me repeat it." He stood up. He crossed the small distance between them. He sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, as close as the chair permitted, and took her face in his hands the way a man handles something he cannot quite believe he is allowed to have, and she looked up at him with those grey eyes she had spent 10 years keeping carefully composed, and they were not composed now. They were entirely, unguardedly herself. He kissed her. Not hurriedly. Not with the restrained formality of people who have been cautious for 6 weeks. With the unhurried certainty of two people who have finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey and are in no rush to be anywhere else. When he pulled back, she was smiling. Not the Marchioness smile. The real one, the one he had only seen a handful of times in his life and which he had, without realizing it, been keeping a private inventory of. The one that reached everything. "Obviously yes," he said. "Don't push it," she said. He laughed. The real laugh, the one Helena had said he no longer possessed, that she had been wrong about, he had simply been storing it somewhere unavailable. It came out now fully and without apology, and the sound of it filled the small room, and Rosalind thought she had never in her life heard anything as good. They told Thomas on Saturday. They did it in the small sitting room, all three of them, in the morning before the park. Rosalind sat on one side of Thomas and Edmund on the other, and they explained it carefully, in the version a 9-year-old could carry. Not all of it, not yet, that would come in layers over years as he grew into being able to hold the weight of it. They told him that Edmund was going to marry his mother. That Edmund was his father. That this meant he would have a different kind of life than the one he'd had in this house with Dunmore. Thomas listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'll still be Vane Dunmore Caldwell," he said. It was not a question. Edmund looked at him. "If you want." "I've been signing it that way for 3 weeks," Thomas said. "It would be confusing to change." Rosalind pressed her lips together. "Also," Thomas said, "I told Miss Henshaw last week that you were going to marry Mother, and she said that was presumptuous of me, and I said I was being observational." He looked at Edmund. "I was right." "You were right," Edmund said. "I usually am." He stood up. He straightened his coat with the slightly ceremonial air he brought to all transitions. Then, in the manner of someone delivering a conclusion they have been working toward, he said, "I should like to call you father. Not Caldwell. I said Caldwell before because I wasn't sure yet. I'm sure now." The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at his son, 9 years old and certain, and standing in the morning light with Rosalind's eyes and his own jaw and something entirely his own in the set of his chin, and said, with a voice that was not entirely level, "I should like that very much." Thomas nodded. "Good. Are we going to the park?" "Yes," Edmund said. "We're going to the park." "I've been practicing the footwork," Thomas said. "On my own. In the hallway. Miss Henshaw disapproves." "Miss Henshaw is correct." "You always say that." "She always is." Thomas went to get his coat. His boots, for once, were already on. Edmund stood up. Rosalind stood with him. She looked at his face and saw what was there, the thing he was not going to say because it was too much for a Saturday morning in a sitting room, and some things needed space around them to be said properly. She touched his arm, briefly, the way you touch something real to confirm it is. He covered her hand with his. They were married in December. Quietly, a small ceremony at the Caldwell family church in the Shropshire countryside, with Helena weeping openly in a manner she later categorically denied, and Thomas standing beside Edmund with his back straight and his chin up, the gravity of the occasion sitting on him with the comfortable weight of something he had been expecting and was pleased to see arrive on schedule. The Ton, deprived of the spectacle of a large London wedding, consoled itself with opinion. There was a great deal of opinion. Lady Pendleton's was the last word, as it always was, delivered at her Wednesday card party in January to an assembled company of people who had been waiting for it. The Duchess of Caldwell, she said, rearranging her cards with the precision of a woman who understood the weight of every word she placed on the table, has shown more character in the last 10 years than every other woman in this room combined, including myself, and I have shown considerable character. She looked around at the assembled faces with her sharp, experienced eyes. Anyone who receives her as anything less than the position she has earned will not be received here. That is the end of the matter. It was the end of the matter. Spring came. It always did. The Caldwell house in Mayfair had been rearranged for 3 people instead of 1, which was a logistical undertaking that Helena supervised with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for an excuse to redecorate for years. Thomas had a set of rooms in the East Wing that he had inspected with the thoroughness of a military assessment and approved, with the single amendment that he required a larger desk because his correspondence had become considerable. His correspondence was with Edmund, who was in Parliament 4 days a week, and who wrote Thomas a letter every day he was away, short, factual letters about what had been argued and decided, written at the level of a very intelligent 9-year-old who was going to understand parliamentary procedure whether Parliament was ready for him or not. Thomas wrote back. His letters were formal and improving, and occasionally contained analysis that Edmund read twice. Rosalind read them over Edmund's shoulder in the evenings. She had opinions about the analysis. Edmund had learned, again, to value this. On a Friday evening in April, a year, precisely, from the night she had sat in Dunmore's study with a box of letters and the London dawn coming up outside the window, Rosalind stood at the drawing-room window of the Caldwell house and looked out at the street below. The evening light was doing the particular April thing it sometimes did, going gold through the early leaves on the trees, and she stood in it and felt it on her face and let herself simply be in it for a moment without managing it. Thomas was at his desk, visible through the open door of the small room off the drawing-room that they had designated his study because he had requested a study, at 9, with the pragmatic certainty of a child who already understood that thinking required dedicated space. He was writing something with his head down and the focused absorption he brought to everything. Edmund was behind her. She had heard him come in 10 minutes ago, the particular sound of his footsteps that she had memorized the way you memorize things you want to keep, and she had not turned around because she was standing in the light and it was good and she wanted both things at once. He came and stood beside her at the window. He looked at the street. She looked at the street. They stood in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence is not empty but full. Thomas has written a critique of your January committee position on the Corn Laws, Edmund said. I know. I helped him with the 2nd paragraph. Edmund looked at her. You agreed with his critique, he said. I always agreed with his critique. I just didn't tell you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you are going to be an enormous problem. You said you wanted a permanent problem. I did. I stand by it. He looked back at the window. The golden light was doing what it did. Are you happy? The question landed simply, without preamble or ceremony. He had always asked questions like that, directly, without the social upholstery that most people wrapped around things that mattered to them, as if the furniture could protect them from the answer. Rosalind turned and looked at him. This face. This maddening, beloved, finally hers and fuller present face. Yes, she said. Not with the measured certainty of a woman performing a feeling. With the plain, full weight of it. I am. Are you? He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned and relearned and was still, occasionally, still learning. The open one, the one she'd seen first in the split second of relief at Lady Ashworth's ball when she said yes before he finished the question. Profoundly, he said. The word was hers, originally. From the garden in 1812. He had kept it for 10 years and given it back, and she felt it come back to her now with everything it had collected along the way. All the ballrooms and the windows and the 3-second gazes and the buried documents and the November morning when he sat across from her and said obviously yes after she did and laughed his real laugh for the first time in a decade. She turned back to the window. He stayed beside her. From the small study, Thomas's pen scratched steadily on paper. Outside, London went about its evening. Carriages, voices, the ordinary magnificent machinery of the world. A world that had, through 10 years of separation and sacrifice and 2 people quietly, stubbornly protecting each other in the dark, arrived at this. A drawing room, a window, an April evening, a child writing at a desk with his father's hands and his mother's eyes and a future that was entirely his own. It was not the ending Rosalind had written for herself at 22. It was the one that had been built slowly, correctly, out of truth and patience and the specific courage of people who have lost things and chosen, anyway, to reach again. Edmund reached over without looking at her and took her hand. She held it. Thomas looked up from his desk. He looked at them, the two of them, standing at the window in the light, holding on, with those grey eyes that missed nothing and said nothing and understood everything. He went back to his letter. He was, after all, very busy. He had a parliament to prepare for.
And that, right there, is the ending they deserved. 10 years. 2 people. And one impossible choice that turned out to be the beginning of everything. If this story lived in your chest the way it lived in mine writing it, drop a comment below and tell me your favourite moment. Was it Thomas and the hands? Edmund telling Gerald the truth? The obviously yes. I need to know. Like this video if Rosalind Vane earned every single thing that came to her. Subscribe because we are nowhere near done. There are more stories like this one waiting, and every single one of them will wreck you in the best possible way. Share this with someone who has been waiting 10 years for their own drawing room window moment. I'll see you in the next one.